So I had a really epic year last year. I did so many different things and learned, so much about myself, and way more happened than in my bio. But I also really want you to know that it was one of the hardest years of my life, because if I don't mention that, I'm just part of a big problem I think we have about not being authentic, like you talked about, not showing the reality of our lives, just putting it on the ups, our perfect life. And it's so funny, that word perfect, like we need to redefine what that means. So I have an autoimmune disease called Crohn's, and admitting this really pisses me off. Like, I don't like admitting it. It feels too serious, and it makes me sound weak, yet I feel really strong. But as I was writing this, it was really funny, because I realised how lucky I am to have it. Why? Because it's an alarm that screams at me when I'm not looking after myself. And it's particularly savage if I'm doing something I don't believe in, that doesn't come from my heart. So that's why I left my job. This isn't even the bit that made me cry as I was practiced. Oh my God. I've got PMS, I honestly do. So that's why I left my job with no job to go to earlier last year. And I took the opportunity to step back, relook at my life. So I'm turning 40 next month. And I just had this feeling that I could blink and I'd be doing exactly the same thing at 50. 40 is also a line we draw in the sand to say that we're generally too old to have kids. And lots of my friends don't have kids and are nearing 40. So many of them would have liked kids, or at least had the choice whether to have them or not. And that can be really tough. Many women feel persecuted or pitied because they don't have kids. And some women, they just can't see a happy future for themselves without their flesh and blood in it. And it's common for women who don't have kids to feel a really big gulf between themselves and mums. And this got me really confused, like not about the sadness about not getting something that you really want or having the choice about it, especially something as intrinsic as procreation. But I was really confused about the feeling unsupported and persecuted about not having kids and being ostracised for it. So I don't have kids, and I don't experience that at all. I also think that some of the neatest and most interesting and generous women I know don't have kids. So how can our experiences of the same thing be so different? So to give you some context, by 2020, 1 in 4 women will never have children. So that's a quarter of women. If 10 women without kids were lined up along here, we'd have 2 like me who never wanted kids, never had them, and have always been crystal clear about that. You'd have 1 on this side who struggles with infertility. And then you have 7 in the middle in this grey area called the socially childless. So this is someone who never met the right person, or the person they met already had kids. And then there's the grey area within the grey area, which is the women that aren't even really sure how they feel about having kids. They just don't know whether they want them or not. And what's really hard for these women and the ones who don't have kids is that the common things that people say about women without children is that, if you make the decision not to, you're going to regret it. Or it's your duty to serve up grandkids. And they talk about how sad and how selfish women who don't have children are. So I started reading blogs and forums by childless women online. And there are tons of groups about learning to deal with the loss of pain of not having kids, which of course is a place, there's a place for that. There's lots of others about fighting against the stereotypes of the crazy cat woman, the barren spinster, the lonely woman behind the blind staring at the family next door wishing they had that life. And there's lots of talk about all the thoughtless and hurtful people there are around, and lots of tips on how to deal with smug mums. But I did not identify with any of that. And it felt really depressing because it's not what I see in my life, and it's not how I feel at all. So where are the stories about the women without kids who feel supported and loved just as they are, including by their friends without kids? By their friends who are mums. So with my time off, I decided to tell my life without kids story and to share others, to shine a new light on life without kids. So the first stories I wrote were mine and my old friend Megan, who is the complete polar opposite of me. She's had and continues to have a heartbreaking journey to have children, and she hasn't had success yet. So without kids, when I interviewed her, she could only see a bleak future of her and her husband withering away in an old people's home and no one visiting them. And she kept her journey secret from everybody, including her family. And she was so angry, she couldn't even find the joy for her friends when they told her that she was pregnant, when they told her they were pregnant. So for her, that just exacerbated how unfair life was. And often she would go home and cry her eyes out because she felt so hurt by all the casual comments that people would make. So our stories went live together on Facebook. And it was exhilarating to read the comments from those without kids who appreciated the refreshing honesty, and from those with kids too, many of whom hoped to bring their children up to follow their instincts and individual paths, even if that meant no grandkids for them. And the response from Megan's family and friends was absolutely beautiful. It was a powerful experience for her and her husband. And by sharing the secret, a massive weight had lifted from their shoulders. So I wrote 30 stories, and I encouraged and supported the women to be authentic and to trust that their bare-bones real stories would be received well. And there were times I was really worried I'd wake up during the night just to check the trolls hadn't arrived. And interestingly, they never did. Even though the stories covered mental health, they covered abortion, they covered infidelity, and of course the successes and challenges, their hopes and dreams. The stories were heart-wrenching and funny and inspiring, often all at the same time, and they were read by thousands of people across the globe. But then I had a run of interactions with women that really weighed me down, like one who would recount a hurtful comment made years ago about not having kids, as if it happened yesterday. Someone that was so defensive that would hear slights and the most innocent comments, one that I wouldn't even have picked up on. And someone who believed that almost every day someone, usually strangers, said something hurtful about not having kids. And yet again, I felt really confused, because why don't I meet these people? Why don't I get hurt like this? How can it be so different? And I really lost my inner drive for the stories, and pretty much life without kids went silent, without notice. But as I thought about it, I realised that my work was done. I realised why some women feel supported and free, and yet others feel persecuted and pitied. I knew it was actually all about the women themselves, but I couldn't find the right words to say it. And this is where I'm going to wind the story back to the start of my story. Why I want you to know that last year was so hard for me, because that's life, right? There's no straight line, and pretending there is helps no one. So my handy health alarm rang again in November. From a culminations of things, I've had to have a lot of surgery on my face. That's why my eyes are a bit manky at the moment. And, where am I up to? And I even had an anxiety attack. I was actually terrified that my brave life changes I'd made early in the year were actually a monumental mistake. And I handled this like a true Kiwi by drinking loads of wine, eating lots of burgers, and burning the candle at both ends till I was dog-tired. I felt so shitty, I had no choice but to make some big changes. So I stopped drinking, which gave me time and energy. I started meditating. I read heaps of books, including one that claimed to cure back pain, and I threw myself into my water sports and shot a 10 kg kingy. It was amazing. I worked on my business. I do a lot of volunteer work, and I love doing that as well. And everything has changed, that quickly. Things are thriving. My personal life is lovely. Health-wise, I feel amazing. And I'm looking to clock in fitter and lighter at 40 than I was at 30 without going on any form of a diet. And I have no back pain, and I'm still not drinking. So I know that life can change in an instant, but for today, at the very least, I'm really grateful. So during this time that I was doing all this personal development, really, I read a quote by someone that finally explained how I feel about a life without kids. But this message is actually for everybody. It's for anyone who's separated or divorced, anyone who's cheated or been cheated on, or been to prison, or had a family member who's been made redundant, who's a single mum or dad, who's got a disability or a health issue, an addiction. It's for those who've been abused and those who've lost a loved one. It's for anyone who's failed or has a failing business, who's financially strapped but's pretending not to be. It's for anyone who's a minority. It's for those who have 3 boys but desperately want a girl. It's for anyone who has mental health issues or a sexual orientation outside the norm. And it's for those women who cannot have children and those who never got the opportunity. And it's for everyone in between. So the quote is from Abby Landy, who's a 26-year-old Australian woman with HIV. She says, "I know a number of people who are discriminated against because they've contracted the HIV virus. But the reason I think I've avoided a lot of the discrimination people with HIV and AIDS face is because I'm really open about it. I'm totally unapologetic. I'm not ashamed. It is what it is." This is what makes me cry. She sums it up by saying, "I think the way that you present yourself goes a long way to how people will react to you." And I'm going to say that again. I think the way you present yourself goes a long way to how people will react to you. So back to Megan. I was at a 40th with her, one of her best friends, the other day, and she told me that Megan was like a new person. She'd been apprehensive to tell Megan that she was pregnant again. But when she did, she could feel Megan's genuine happiness for her. So I called Megan just a couple of days ago to ask what she thought of Abby Landy's quote. And she told me that before telling her story on Life Without Kids, that she felt shame. She felt there was something intrinsically wrong with her because she couldn't have kids. But since then, she's come to realise that life throws curveballs at you and you just have to deal with it. She said what's happened doesn't define us, how we deal with it does. And she's found that by being more open about her journey, people are responding to her in a really thoughtful way. So, what have I learned about my work on A Life Without Kids? I've learned that we need to get rid of shame. We need to stop silencing ourselves because we're worried about what people think. We need to claim our space and tell our story because they're real and they're ours to tell. And that creates a safe space for others to share their stories. So let's own our lives and let's make being real, the new perfect.